Hey everybody, Mr. Bear here, and today's lesson is about how to identify and then go on to explain the tone of a given selection in a paragraph. And so the concept of how to do that, it's actually fairly complex. There's not just one step, there's several steps. So let's take a look at what those steps are. In order to write an analysis, the first thing you want to do, obviously, or I hope it's obvious, is to read the selection thoughtfully. I would recommend and I would encourage and I submit to you that reading it at least twice through is way more helpful than just getting through it once. The first reading is usually just for comprehension. Second and subsequent readings can be more targeted and focused, looking for figurative language, looking for patterns, looking for shifts. Those are all things that a second or third or any subsequent reading can help you do better now that once you understand in general what the piece is about. And some pieces, I can tell you from personal experience, require many, many readings to really get to the bottom of it. Shakespeare is famous for being so layered in terms of technique and content and theme, all of those things. So anyway, a second or third reading is a good idea. So that's the first step. Second step is then to identify an appropriate tone. In many selections, there might be more than one tone. In longer selections, the tone might change and be modified and shift over the course of an entire piece. But regardless, there's going to be at least one good tone word that you're going to want to come away with as an identifier, and that will allow you to do some writing. The third step is to find good examples from the text. What's a good example? Well, it kind of depends on the piece, but you want to find more examples than you know you're going to use. That way you know that you've got a good base to start from. And that's one of the areas we're going to focus on is how to work with those examples. And then finally, you need to actually write the explanation. We will be reviewing our paragraph model ESEC or EESEC, if you want to call it that. If that's new to you, don't worry, got you covered. I'll kind of show you some other paragraph models and how it relates to those, and hopefully we can hook into some prior knowledge that way. So what we're going to be doing is taking each of those 4 steps one by one, and I will walk you through those techniques and kind of talk you through my thought processes because this analysis is going to have to be done by me as a reader, and my analysis might look different than yours, but I will try to demonstrate and model for you the techniques of good analysis. So we need to start with a selection, and the selection we're going to use today is a poem by a guy named Peter Wilde, and the poem is called Roaches. And so I'm just going to take you through and read through the selection, and then we'll talk about it on the other side. So you can just follow along, and I'll read it aloud. Last night, when I got up to let the dog out, I spied a cockroach in the bathroom, crouched flat on the cool porcelain, delicate antennae probing the toothpaste cap and feasting himself on a gob of it in the bowl. I killed him with one unprofessional blow, scattering arms and legs and half his body in the sink. I would have no truck with roaches, crouched like lions in the ledges of sewers, their black eyes in the darkness alert for tasty slime, breeding quickly and without design, laboring up drain pipes through filth to the light. I read once they are among the most antediluvian of creatures, surviving everything, and in more primitive times thrived to the size of your hand. Yet when sinking asleep or craning at the stars, I can feel their light feet probing in my veins, their whiskers nibbling the insides of my toes, and, neck arched, feel their patience scrambling up the dark tubes of my throat. So our first step is done. We've read the poem, and we can talk a little bit through the poem and what it means and stuff. We'll kind of do that embedded into the process rather than going back through and reading it twice or 3 times. But our first step is, for all intents and purposes, done. So we're going to move on to the second step to identify an appropriate tone. However, in order to identify the tone, the first thing that you need to do, there's a checklist for that as well. Before you can identify a tone, which is an attitude of a speaker or a narrator towards the subject that they're talking about, before you can identify the tone, you have to identify what's the subject that they're talking about or that they have a tone about. In this case, it's pretty simple. I picked a poem that hopefully will be, it's a pretty surface level poem. There's not a whole lot of abstraction and symbolism and things like that. It's a poem about roaches, right? The actual creature roaches. So we know what the subject is. It's a poem about roaches. So what exactly is the speaker in terms of the voice that we hear in the poem? What is the speaker's attitude towards roaches? So this is a good opportunity to point out that the narrator of the poem, the speaker in the poem, the person who has gone through this experience that we read about in the poem, is not the author. The author is Peter Wilde. He has created this speaker. We call it in poetry, we call it a persona. He has created this persona to go through these experiences. So we need to remember that the narrator here is a character that's been created by the author, Peter Wilde. So what is this character's attitude toward roaches? Well, when we talk about tone, there are a lot of different resources online. Here's an example. I think this one is available to you in your unit on Canvas. This is an example of a bank or list of tone words. This one is nice because it's broken down into positive, negative, and then humor, irony, sarcasm categories. The reason why humor, irony, and sarcasm has its own category is because oftentimes irony can seem negative when it's actually positive, or vice versa. And it plays with and blurs that line between positive and negative, humorous and serious. So it's important that we recognize that blurred line when we're dealing with irony or satire or humor. But it doesn't really take a Rhodes Scholar to notice that this speaker's attitude towards roaches is not positive. This guy is not a member of the International Roach Appreciation Society. That's pretty obvious. So we know that we can narrow things down to this negative category. So let's scan through that negative category and see if we can find anything that kind of jumps out at us. And it's worth noting here that this is a great opportunity to examine your own level of vocabulary. If you look at some of these words on this tone list and you don't know what they are, it's a good opportunity to grab a dictionary, grab your phone, and take a look at what those words mean so you can narrow down and maybe select just that perfect word. If you're stuck with only having a few words to describe tone, like happy or sad or mad or scared or something like that, those are okay for lower level grades, I would imagine, and for people that are more in the entry level of literary analysis. But at this level, we need to really expand our vocabulary and get specific. That's the benefit of having words like this, is that they're way more specific than just mad or sad or scared. So when we take a look at through some of these terms, for example, you might not have any idea what the word condemnatory means. We know it's negative because it's in the list as being negative, but what exactly does that word mean? Well, to condemn something usually means to have a lot of negative things to say about it, to criticize it. So condemnatory, you could say, is kind of like accusing, right? It's making some sort of condemning statement. To condemn something, if you've ever heard that term before, a building that's condemned is about to be blown up and torn down. So that gives you an idea. And so you can figure out the meanings of some of these words just through the context. But anyway, if there are words on here that you don't know, it's on you to look them up and figure out what they are. So as we scan through the list, we know that it's not really a snooty tone. This person isn't saying, "Oh, I'm so much better than roaches are," right? He's not furious. I mean, when he smashes the roach and blows it up into 1,000 pieces, yeah, I suppose you could say that that's kind of furious. But overall, the tone is not a furious one. He doesn't use a lot of really, really heavy vocabulary in his poem that indicates that he's furious. That's way too far, right? We don't see him being desperate. There's not a sense of desperation. I mean, he's in control, right? He smashes the roach and then he, kind of talks smack about it for a while for the rest of the poem. So it's not really desperate either. So there's a couple that might catch our eye, right? You might go with the generic angry because, again, he says at this point in the poem, he says, "I would have no truck with roaches." Well, that expression, it's actually a British expression that mostly found its way into the South, to say, "I don't have no truck with that," meaning I don't want to have anything to do with that, right? So there's a sense of an anger towards that subject. So in general, angry is in the right ballpark, but it's not really specific enough. And besides the fact that it's a little too personal, there are a couple places in the poem where we see that, he's doesn't like roaches, but it's not a personal dislike. It's not like, the guy that ran over his dog or something like that. It's the roaches haven't done anything to him. They're just horrible creatures. So it's not really anger for some injustice that's been done to him. So that's not really specific enough. But how about, let's take a look at, how about hateful? Right? Think about how hateful would work for this poem. Certainly we get the idea in this stanza where he says that he kills him with one unprofessional blow. The guy clearly is not a dispassionate professional exterminator. This is not just another day at the office. When he sees a roach, he smashes it with one shot. He doesn't fumigate. He doesn't grab it and throw it out the window or out the door or something like that. He smashes it into a million pieces, right? And he doesn't really sound like he's very apologetic about dismembering this thing. Speaking of which, have you ever heard anybody referring to a cockroach as having arms? So what does that tell you? It tells you, well, maybe he's trying to he thinks of the roach almost like a person, right? Because people have arms and legs. Animals, especially insects, aren't ever generally referred to as having arms. Maybe the praying mantis because it's got that weird, whatever. But bugs don't have arms. They have legs. And so saying arms and legs gives us a more human thing, which leads to that more hateful thing, right? He sees this as a really nasty, disgusting person. And I just gave away the next word that I wanted to point out to you, which is the word disgusted. There's a lot of evidence in this poem to demonstrate that he is disgusted by those creatures. If you look at all of the references to the roach's movement, if you look at all the references to the roach's environment, to the roach's kind of history or its heredity, there's nothing pleasant about these creatures. So when we get to our analysis, we're going to put hateful and disgusted as our two best choices, and I'd probably say that disgusted is the best choice, but we'll leave them both up there for now, and we'll decide maybe to narrow down at a later point. Okay, so if we return to our little task list here, we can see that we have done the first task. We have read the selection thoughtfully, and we've got a couple of good candidates for our appropriate tone word. So we're good to go. We're halfway there. So our next step is to find some good examples from the text. So let's take a look back in the poem. And at this point, it's good to point out that there's a couple of different ways to go about finding examples in a text. Most people would say to start at the beginning and work your way through chronologically. And there's a good reason for that. A lot of poems and other selections are done chronologically rather than lyrically. So what that means is that there's a story, there's a plot, there's events that move through time. And because of that, we might see that the tone shifts over the course of that time that exists within the story. And so it's easier for us to spot those shifts if we are walking through it step by step by step by step. And in short selections like poetry, there's really no reason not to walk through it step by step. But some people, especially if you're really, really sure of your tone word, I mean, I'm pretty sure that we're going to be using at least disgusted, but maybe hateful as well. So because I'm so assured of that I'm pretty darn sure that that's the right word to use, that I could kind of cherry pick my examples. And the danger of that is if you're not 100% sure that the tone word is the right one, then cherry picking might not work. Let me give you an example of how that could be. Let's take a look at the word delicate right here in the middle of the first stanza. The word delicate almost has a feminine and a feminine kind of a connotation, right? And when we think of something that's delicate, it's something that we need to take great care with. It's something that we need to protect, something that's easily broken, right? So if you just take that word, you could say, oh, well, this guy is really protective of roaches, and he really wants to make sure that no harm comes to the roach. That might make sense out of context. But when you put that word in the context of everything else, the word delicate, I think, when I look at the poem, it actually serves, because he's talking about the antennae of the roach, right? Those little things like this, right? Now imagine that roach is on your forearm, And imagine that you can feel the very tips of those really thin, like little hairs, those really thin antennae going like this back and forth across your skin, right? That's not a pleasant image for most people. It gives you the heebie-jeebies, right? It makes you want to. So the word delicate is not a positive word. So we have to be careful cherry picking examples of text. So it's good to go through it bit by bit in this particular case. So we're going to do that. And again, remember that we're looking for things that seem to imply a hateful or disgusted tone. Good examples of that. So what you see that I've done here is I just highlighted a few words that right off the bat in the poem, when we're looking at the actions or the potential actions of this cockroach, we can see that he is intending for us to be a little bit grossed out by what this thing is doing and a little creeped out by it. So when we hear that the cockroach is crouched and that the antennae are probing and that he's feasting on this gob of toothpaste, those are all things that are not meant for us to go, oh, how pleasant. That's like, ew, that's nasty. So those three words all close together could actually serve as one example. And I'll show you how to work that in later on when we get to the paragraph writing part of it. So after finding an example of, as we move through the poem, after finding an example of his disgusted tone, we have a really, really good example of his hateful tone. And this is something I mentioned earlier about the nature of the squashing of the bug, an unprofessional blow. The word blow is like, it sounds like a boxer, right? Landing blows on his opponent. And so this guy is serious about killing this creature. And it's a really graphic and unapologetic and very, very grotesque image of the result of his unprofessional blow, and this thing's legs and body are scattered all over the place. Pretty nasty. So that's a great example of his hateful attitude. Here's another expression. I think I mentioned that earlier too, about having no truck with roaches. That's an expression of hate or dislike, certainly. And so that kind of fits in that category. And take a look at the rest of this stanza. I'm going to pause here and then I'll highlight so you can see another example. We'll just take a second now. Can you find examples in this section right here at the bottom of this first column? Can you see an example of his disgusted tone? Take a second. Okay, so what we can see here is that there are a lot of great words, individual words, and some images that really help us to see that this is a disgusting creature that lives in a disgusting place and does disgusting things and has disgusting features and all that kind of thing. So notice we have the repetition. Repetition is always important in poetry. The repetition of the word crouched, again, there's almost an inherent danger there. And so that kind of a creature that lives in a sewer and is ready to strike conjures up images of the old urban legends of crocodiles growing in the sewers and crawling up through people's toilets and things like that. But so they have black eyes, they eat slime, excuse me, they breed quickly. There's that sense like that there's an infestation and it's growing out of control, that kind of thing. So there's a definite disgusting image of piles and piles of these roaches like crawling out of things. By the way, I'm going to pause here. There's a great movie called Creepshow. It's an old R-rated horror flick from the early 1980s. I think it was in 1981. Stephen King, the great horror author, co-wrote the film, I believe. And he actually stars in one of the little episodes. There's 5 little vignettes, little short stories. And the last one is this guy played by E.G. Marshall, this old, now long dead actor. And he's this very uppity, very rich recluse, billionaire. It's a reference to Howard Hughes, who was a really famous guy who he holed himself up and put himself in like a germ-free environment because he was a real germaphobe. And so this kind of plays on that. And this guy has got himself locked in his apartment because he finds roaches, right, crawling in up through his drain pipe and out of his cereal box. And it gets really nasty. I won't give away the ending, but it's really grotesque. But that's the first thing I think of is this idea that they're breeding quickly. And if we don't stop them, they're going to get out of control, right? Climbing up through your drain pipes and all that. So a lot of really disgusting images here at the bottom of this second stanza. So the third stanza doesn't really have much. Actually, the tone changes here. If I was going to be writing a really advanced piece of analysis, I would say that this third stanza actually shows a certain amount of respect, historically speaking, for this creature. The word antediluvian, you can see down at the bottom there, refers to before the flood. So the Great Flood, a lot of religions have the Great Flood myth, and the story about this flood that wipes out all the creatures on Earth. And so this speaker is talking about how he read that these creatures are ancient, right? They've been around forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And so there's a certain grudging respect that you could say that he has for this creature, that they've lived through everything. But we do have one thing that you could certainly qualify as being kind of an image of disgust, which is the size of these creatures. Think about a cockroach that's that big, right? The size of your hand. And imagine now that cockroach in your hand and being that size and where it might go from there, right? So that's a pretty big bug. I've seen a couple of beetles that were pretty big like that, but I've never seen a roach that big. So it's meant to kind of gross us out. Then the last few lines of the entire poem are just pure gross out nightmare fuel, right? All of these things right here, their whiskers nibbling the insides of my toes, not his toes, the insides of his toes. They are now inside his body. I missed one. The light feet probing in my veins. Now they're crawling through his blood vessels, right? And the patient scrambling up the dark tubes of my throat was really nasty. So the imagery there is all about being totally disgusted. Okay, so when we take a look at the net effect here, what we can see is that there's a lot more evidence to support one of those tone words than the other, right? We can see that disgusted is far and away the one that's going to give us the most amount of evidence to work with. And so that's what we're going to do, is we're going to stick with that one. We'll just take hateful out of there. So we know that this is the word we're going to work with. So let's return back to our little checklist here. Now we have found a whole bunch of good examples from the text. We're doing well. So we have one step left. And of course, this is the one that's a little bit more complicated because it requires constructing ideas in complete sentences and using complete thoughts. A note about structure. If you are new to our school, if you're new to our system, and you haven't been given the finer points of our paragraph model that we developed here at the high school a number of years ago, then it's probably important to chat just a little bit about that. So our paragraph model, if this is a review for you, then so much the better. So our paragraph model is called ESEC, and it looks kind of complicated, and the acronym is kind of funky, but we thought it was more detailed, and it allowed for students to have a clearer picture of what the entire paragraph looked like, even some of the structural bits that don't really bring a lot of meaning to the paragraph, but it shows you what your responsibility is as a communicator. So the ESEC model, just as a review, you establish a topic sentence, right? You want to make sure you're really clear up front as to what this paragraph is going to be about. Then you expand on that idea. In some cases, you want to provide a brief illustration. Sometimes you want to define one of the terms that you use in your topic sentence because it's important to narrow things down and to refine that main idea. Then you provide support. That's where your evidence or your example comes in. Then you explain that evidence and how the evidence supports your main point. And then you conclude saying some sort of wrap-up thing. This is where, in conclusion, the infamous in conclusion comes into play. But if you aren't familiar with ESEC, you may be familiar with some other types of paragraph models. There is the very unfortunately acronymed Point Evidence Explanation, or P. That's just an awful name, but there you go. But it's got the same basic structure as ESEC, right? The point is the topic sentence. The evidence is your support, and then the explanation is the explanation. They just don't bother to do that expand and conclude pieces because it's more of a stylistic choice to do those extra things. We just think it's a good idea to connect your ideas together a little bit more coherently. But point evidence explanation has been used for decades all over the country, all over the world, really. It's the standard expository paragraph model. So we just decided to add a little bit more detail to it. And there's another model called TRI, topic, restriction, illustration. It's the same idea, right? Topic, sentence. Restriction is kind of narrowing things down. And then the illustration in the TRI model, the illustration and the explanation kind of go together. So your support and explain steps would be kind of lumped into one. So even if you don't quite understand ESEC, you understand probably the concept of a good paragraph, which is you set up a point that you're going to try to prove, you throw some evidence in there that supports your point, and then you have to explain in detail how your evidence supports your point. And that explain part is where a lot of young writers fall down. They tend to think that the evidence is its own explanation. I've seen a lot of paragraphs where somebody says, it's clear that in this poem, the author, or the character is scared, right? And so they provide a quote in the text. The character says, "I'm really frightened," and then they write for their analysis. They write, "This shows that the character is scared." No, it doesn't. That's like, and I've used this example in my classes before. That's like an attorney in a murder trial with a gun as the weapon. It's like the attorney looking at the jury and saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, we conclude that the defendant killed the victim with the gun." And then the attorney walks over to the evidence table and picks up the gun in its little plastic baggie and says, "Here's the gun. I rest my case." Well, that certainly wouldn't work in a courtroom environment, and it doesn't work in a classroom environment when we're explaining how our evidence supports our point. You can't just say that the evidence does its job on its own. You have to connect the dots for us. And that's my little pet term that I love to use. Connect the dots. Show us how you got from your evidence to your conclusion. And that's what the explanation is really all about. So let's start with the topic sentence, right? In this case, when we do an introductory sentence like this, or a topic sentence, we want to, and we're talking about literature or a selection that we're going to be analyzing, we always want to include the author in the title of the piece, right? And our purpose for this particular paragraph is to identify and then to explain the tone. We don't need to do the explain part yet in the topic sentence. We just need to identify the word that is going to be kind of like our thesis statement, right? The key word here is disgusted. So that's all we do in our first sentence. And what I'm going to show you here is how we build the paragraph. By the time it's done, it's really huge. But piece by piece, they're not really that complicated of steps. So our first step is to establish our topic sentence. And by the way, hopefully, if you're a previous student from Dallas, that this is more review than anything else. Let's hope. So we have our topic sentence. He creates a disgusted tone in his poem. And by the way, this word creates, you could substitute establishes. You could say emphasizes a disgusted tone. There's a couple options there, so that it doesn't have to be the same topic sentence over and over and over again, because you're going to be practicing this a lot. So after we establish the topic sentence or the main idea, then we want to expand upon that. This step, again, you're not going to have to write using the ESEC model in college, for example. Nobody's heard of the ESEC model in college. Maybe some folks at Western, because we're so close, and maybe they've seen enough Dallas students that they know, they've talked about it. But the expand thing isn't really a requirement. It's just a good idea. So let me show you an example of how that works. So we've said in his poem, Peter Wilde creates a disgusted tone. How do we expand on that? Well, how about this? He uses a variety of descriptive words and phrases. Instead of just saying he creates the tone, we could go into a little bit more detail about what we're going to be talking about as part of our evidence. Descriptive words and phrases, right? It's not very detailed because we want to save that detail until later in the paragraph. But we can provide a little bit of added detail that way. And then we can also demonstrate that we know the word tone, we know what it means, because we can restate what that term, what the definition of that term is. The tone is the attitude of the speaker in the poem. So if you do that, it reads like you're going into a little bit more detail without getting into your examples yet. So in his poem, Roaches, Peter Wilde creates a disgusted tone. He uses a variety of descriptive words and phrases to establish the attitude of the speaker towards the roaches. This green sentence, this second sentence here, is exactly the same as the first sentence. It's just got different words and it's more detailed. And that's the benefit of doing that, is it kind of reinforces your point. When you can say the same thing in multiple ways, it really demonstrates that you know what you're talking about. So that's one of the reasons why we like to emphasize it. So the next thing is our evidence. Working evidence into a paragraph can be tricky, and it takes practice, and it's kind of an art form. There's no one correct way to do it. I have ways that I teach my students to do it. I'm going to try to model those here. But there's really not a correct answer. The key thing is that it needs to be smoothly woven in to your own writing as an analyst. You want to weave in that evidence instead of just taking a big giant hunk of text and dropping it in there all at once. That's not very effective, because it interrupts the flow of your argument that you're making, right? And this is an argumentative. You could say that this is an argument because somebody could argue with you. They could say, no, it's not a disgusted tone. You could say it's a jovial tone, or it's a paranoid tone, or something like that. You could throw in any word there you want, but we've chosen disgusted, so we need to back up our statement, right? It's kind of like an argument. So here's how we could work in our evidence. We know, actually, we're going to back up here. We know that we want to use the yellow, the stuff that's in the yellow, right? If you're doing multiple examples of evidence within a selection, and you know you're going to be doing an ESEC, which is 2 pieces of support with 2 explanations or more, then you probably want to work your way through chronologically, right? Instead of starting with an example at the end of the poem and then working back to the middle of the poem for some reason. There's ways that you can do that, but it doesn't make as much sense. So let's stick to what makes the most sense. Use an early example and then go to a later example. So let's take a look at how I've worked in evidence, and so I can kind of model the proper format. So let's look at the third element, the element in blue, or the last sentence here that we have on this paragraph. In the second stanza, that's called location, right? I've narrowed it down. So instead of talking about the entire poem, now we're going to narrow it down to the second stanza. So that's called location. After the speaker describes smashing a roach to bits, that's what's called context. I'm providing knowledge of what's already happened in the poem and what's going on when this example takes place. That's a really crucial thing for demonstrating your comprehension, your understanding of what the poem's all about. So my pet thing that I use is called location, context, quotation. So you provide the location of where your example is. You provide some context, what's going on when this example happens. What has just happened would be one way of doing it. And then you provide the quotation itself. So in the second stanza, after the speaker describes smashing a roach to bits, he uses words like crouched, slime, and filth to describe the actions and habitat of the creature. So notice what I did. I used 3 individual words as a little preview. That's called diction. 3 individual words that support my point, but I've used them as one kind of clumped example. You can do that if they're close enough together and if they serve the same purpose. So that's my first piece of evidence. Notice I have not done any analysis yet, right? In the ESEC model, all we want to focus on is just the support, just the evidence. It's all we want to focus on. Next is what comes the explanation. And here's where my analysis might differ from yours. I'm an English teacher, and I love to write, and I love words. So I'm going to probably use a lot more than you will. And there's nothing wrong with using less words as long as they're good words and as long as they're accurate words. I tend to use more words. So don't freak out when I scroll down here and you see the number of words that I wrote in my analysis. I'm trying to model that in-depth kind of explanation. So here we go. At this point in the poem, he's reflecting on the creature he's just killed. And in his mind, he is creating images of these creepy crawly creatures as ready to strike and living in absolutely sickening conditions, which makes the bug dangerous and disease-ridden. All of these examples point to qualities and conditions that the speaker finds revolting, a synonym. So the best word to sum up his tone is disgusted. So that's my thought process. That's how I connect the dots. I look at what words he uses and what that does when those words get used. What connections, what inferences do we draw when we see those words? And I'm trying to connect those dots between the words that he uses and the idea of what's revolting. Introducing the idea that we're talking about danger and disease. Those are things that are disgusting, right? When we talk about insects. I use some wordplay, creepy crawly creatures. that implies a disgusted kind of a tone just in and of itself. Sickening conditions, sickening, disgusted, same thing. So you can see that by using specific explanation structures, I can actually emphasize that I'm connecting my point. Okay, so here's my evidence: crouched, slime, and filth. And here's the way that I describe how crouched, slime, and filth lead us to that disgusted tone. This is absolutely the most crucial part of this kind of explanation, and it's one that we'll be reinforcing and asking you to practice and demonstrate over and over again, because it's not easy. You'll get used to it and you get better at it as you practice and as you get feedback. But this is really the most important part. By the way, also notice the yellow, or the first sentence, that's the first element, is one sentence long. The second element, also one sentence long. The third element, also one sentence long. The fourth element, though, is 1, 2, 3 sentences long. And those are 3 relatively long sentences. So the idea is that this is what I, as a teacher, am going to be looking for when it comes to your understanding of what good explanation is all about, is more detail, more words. I can't really put it any more simply than that. The more words you use for your description or for your explanation, the more words you use, generally the better off you're going to be. Okay? It's not always the case. Some people tend to ramble, as I'm doing right now. But generally in literary analysis, more analysis is preferable to less. So we know that we're focusing on not just, I'm going to scroll up here, not just the ESEC model, but we want to do the ESEC model, which is 2 pieces of evidence with explanation within the paragraph, right? So knowing that, I'm just going to demonstrate for you here. I'm just going to show you my second bit of evidence and explanation. Okay, so here's evidence, and then explanation, a few sentences of explanation, then more evidence. This one's a little bit longer because my example, my evidence is a little bit more detailed. And then explanation. Notice that my 2 pieces of explanation are about the same length. It's a good thing to do. Sometimes you can be more detailed in one than the other, but it's a good thing to shoot for a couple, 3 sentences of explanation every time you need to explain evidence. All right. So our next piece of evidence is from the end of the poem. Notice I say later in the poem. There's my location, then my context. After he thinks about how ancient the roach is, he provides nightmare fuel by imagining the bugs inside of him. And then I provide the actual quotations. Okay? And I just stack them up, one on top of the other. Those 3 images that we have. Sorry, I'm scrolling. These 3 images are one right after the other in the poem. So I'm just going to stack them all up as one overall example because they all have the same basic point, right? Which is there's bugs inside of me and they're crawling around inside of me. And in one case, they're crawling up trying to get out of me. And so I'm craning my neck because I can feel this thing and I want to get my face as far away from the bugs as possible. There's a palpable sense of disgust there, right? Getting the chicken skin, just thinking about a bug crawling up the inside of my throat. Like, ugh, nasty. So that's the example that I want to use is those last 3 images. And notice I use the word vivid image, right? Because that's really what this is. Again, little spoiler alert for our next piece. We're going to be talking about imagery as one technique that authors use to get across their point. So my analysis says this. In each of those phrases, we get the vivid image of a bug inside of our bodies and in the most unsettling of places. Most people would be grossed out by having a bug in the back of their hand. This guy imagines them literally inside of his veins, his toes, and his throat. Many people would get the cold shivers and the chicken skin thinking things like that, which is why the word disgusted is the best choice of tone. Notice I didn't use exactly the same closer for my analysis here as I did here. Again, variety is really important when you're doing analysis because it demonstrates that you have more flexibility with language. That being said, if you use the same basic phrases each time, as long as they're valid phrases, then that works just fine. So when we take a look at that, that's a lot, right? There's a lot of words there. But if you go back and look at it step by step, it's really not anything more than just putting one foot in front of the other, right? Start out with establishing the topic sentence. We've got an expansion of that topic sentence. We use an example. We explain that example. We do the same thing again. And so the only thing left to do is to kind of put the cherry on the sundae. This is, again, one of those things that in college level writing, it may even be discouraged by some writing professors. And it's not necessarily something you always have to do in non-academic writing. But if you notice in advertising, they do this all the time. They always give some sort of a zinger, a closer, a wrap-up. So it's something that psychologically we need as readers and listeners. We need for somebody to close things out. It's in theater, they used to call it claptrap. When somebody would say something at the end of a scene and the lights would go down, that's a signal to the audience. We clap now, right? And if you've ever been in an audience for something where people weren't really sure when to clap, right? It's because there's no clear signal that something was done or finished. And so in writing, it's a good idea. So we're just going to throw a simple sentence at the end, returning to our opening idea: Peter Wilde, Roaches, disgusted tone. Those are the three key components. So we're just going to repackage it. Therefore, it's clear that Peter Wilde creates a disgusted tone in his poem Roaches. It's really pretty much the same thing as the first sentence. It's just the order is flipped around a little bit. It's very functional. This is not something I'm going to spend hours like writing comments like your concluding sentences are awful. As long as they serve their purpose, they'll be fine. So there's our complete paragraph. And again, that's a lot of words. Right? But if you take it one step at a time, and as you get practiced at it, it'll be easier to fill in all the parts of this process, right? Again, your paragraphs will most likely not be as long as this. That's okay. The things I would counsel you to do is to strive to have more than one sentence for your analysis and to do multiple examples within a paragraph. You can certainly get by with one if it's really well written and if your analysis is pretty detailed, but two generally shows that you've got your bases covered better than just one. You certainly don't want to use 3, 4, 5, 6 examples in one paragraph. That's more of an essay length type of thing. So 2 is a good magic number that shows variety and depth without going too far overboard. So that's really all there is to it. We're going to scroll back up to our opening here. So we have done all 4 steps, and that's basically what you need to know about writing an analysis of tone in a paragraph. And I would just leave you with the idea that out of all of these steps, really the key step, the place where it all starts is with reading that selection thoughtfully. Making sure that you have explored different possibilities, making sure that you've really looked carefully at the words in the poem, that you've eliminated any possibility of missing a point just because you didn't know what one of the words in the poem meant or the selection. Of course, you can do this for any written selection, whether it's drama or whether it's a short story or a novel or a nonfiction article in a newspaper. You can analyze tone in anything, but make sure that you know what it is that you're reading. And that sometimes is more time consuming for some writers to be able to read and understand. Get as much help as you need to really understand the selection that you're reading. And that's going to lead to better analysis, simply because you're going to know more of what you're talking about. So that read thoughtfully part is really the keystone to the whole process. So I hope that this has been helpful, and I hope that this will get you to write better analysis, more in-depth analysis, and a more structured analysis that'll help you get those good grades that you're looking for. Thanks for watching.